Okay, welcome to our first webinar. Everything you wanted to know about speech and language and didn't know who to ask. I'm Uri Schneider, co-director of Schneider Speech. Our office is in New York in the 5 boroughs. We have 5 offices and a great team led by myself, but most importantly, my father, Dr. Phil Schneider. And we work with kids with all kinds of different speech and language issues, including stuttering, voice problems, learning issues, complicated learning issues, articulation issues, as well as general speech improvement. And our work is kind of unique because we work with young ones and also school age, high school, college, and adults. So most of the people who are watching this are parents, teachers, professionals who care about young kids and their speech and language. And one of the biggest questions that they ask is, number one, how do we know if our child is doing the kind of things that they should be doing? And the next thing they want to know is, what can they do to help their child's speech and language move along? So my comments today will be around mostly young children, children who are going through preschool, as well as the younger grades of grade school. So children in preschool, I'm thinking about kids from the age of 0 to 5, obviously before preschool and through preschool, as well as kids who are going into the early grades in school, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, between the ages of 6 and 10. So I think the first thing to know is there are a couple points that I'm going to focus on today. The first one is going to be about looking at how they listen. Before we look at what kids are going to say, we need to look at what they're doing when they're listening. The second thing we're going to talk about is that speech and language is not just at the lips, and it's not just in your throat, and it's not just in your head. Speech and language is part of communication, and that puts together your head and your heart, and we'll talk about that. The third thing we'll talk about is the different parts of language. So language is comprised of a couple different parts. And once you understand these parts, you can start to understand where your child is at and what you can do to move and help with those different parts of their language development. The last thing we'll talk about is diagnosis and treatment, to kind of figure out what are some of these different acronyms that people use and what those things mean. I'll give you some general ideas about that. And then the very last thing, kind of a bonus, is how do you find the right professional and what are some things you can do to help your own child? All right, so let's get started. Again, we're going to start on the first point about kids' speech and language and what we need to know about that. So whether your child is talking or not talking yet, the most important thing is to look at not what they say, but how they listen, how they pay attention. There's an interesting thing. Most people think I'm a dentist. They bring their kids to the office and they want to ask a lot of questions. What color is this? Can you name this? How many of those? What's your name? What's her name? Asking all kinds of questions. But what's more interesting than asking questions and pulling teeth and pulling the words out of the kid is looking at how they understand. Why is that important? It's very simple. Some of us may talk more than one language, whether it was Spanish in high school or some semester abroad. All of us who have experienced speaking a second language, if we ask ourselves, do I speak that language better or do I understand that language better? We would all agree that any second language that we speak, we understand more than we can speak. And that's true for anyone who's bilingual. So that's also true for all of our kids. Before they're going to be able to say anything, they need to be able to understand it. So if the child doesn't understand the color purple, he's not going to be able to say the color purple on demand when you point to the purple crayon. So the first thing we want to do is, rather than pulling the words out of the kid, we want to make sure that we put the language into the kid. So there are a number of ways we can do that, but the biggest thing to think about is that this is a major paradigm shift. Instead of pulling words out, we want to put language in. And the way to do that is exposing a child to age-appropriate content, age-appropriate language, and a lot of opportunities to hear the words, to see the way people pronounce the words. So letting children see our faces. There are a lot of times we're in the car and we're in the front seat, the child's in the back seat, and we might have a mirror so we can see the baby, but most of the time the child doesn't see us, and certainly as our kids get older. So talking to your kid when we're not looking at them is not the best way to help them with their speech and language. But if we can make sure that we're face to face, eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder, and we can give them a good opportunity to hear what we're saying, not too much background noise, not too much extraneous noise that they might need to filter out, but giving it to them in as direct a way as possible. Giving them a chance to see our face, to see our gestures, to see our expressions, and letting them see how our articulators, how our lips and our tongue put these words together. That's going to help our kids learn how to say the words that we want them to be able to say. So again, before pulling the words out of them, we want to give them opportunities to learn, to hear, to see, and to have fun with these different words. Another outcome of this would be that if a parent comes to our office and they say to us, well, I'm not sure my child's language is ready for preschool or ready for first grade. Much of the testing that we're going to do in our office, we don't do a lot of formal testing, tabletop testing, asking a lot of questions and seeing how the child responds, although those tests are very important. In our office, we're often assessing children's speech and language through play. And why is it important to do that through play? It's not all fun and games, and just because it looks simple doesn't mean it's simplistic. But in essence, if you want to see a child's speech and language, you don't want to see how they do in the most contrived situation with the new person that they don't know, who they're not related to, who they haven't had a chance to warm up with. And who knows, maybe that day they're not even feeling well. If you want to get a good sample of your child's language, we recommend that you come to the office or do this for yourself at home. Record your child when they don't even know it. Let the iPhone or whatever smartphone or camera you have, put it into video mode, start recording video, lean it on the couch or some shelf, and as you're playing on the carpet with the child, or you're reading books with the child, or you're doing a bedtime routine with the child, and they're really cozy and comfortable and chatty and interactive, that's a great time to kind of get a naturalistic sample and see how they interact. And when you bring that to a professional like ourselves or another, that professional is going to have a window and a sample to really see your child at their best, you know, to see something that's really representative. And through that, we can see what kind of focus they demonstrate, how attentive are they, what kind of rhythm is there between the speaker and the listener, and then what kind of dance and rhythm is there in the conversation, in the back and forth. Is the child really quiet and just listening to the parent doing all the talking? Is the parent doing all the talking and not really giving the child a chance to talk? Or in other cases, letting the child just do all the talking and not taking any turns or not wanting to interrupt the child. The best language, the best speech and language is going to be when there's communication that's balanced, where the speaker, be it the adult and child, so let's say you have an adult and a child, the speaker and the listener and the speaker share the talking time about 50-50. So if the child is really young and not talking a lot, that means that the adult might want to think about regulating their speech and language to match the level of the child. That doesn't mean talking silly. It doesn't mean mispronouncing the words like the child might mispronounce the words, but it means getting down at the language level of the child, getting down at the level of the interests of the child, and then making sure that the rhythm, the pace, the speed, the language, the words we use, and the topics we're talking about are at the level of the child. They're of interest to the child. They're not adult interests, not really the child's interests, because obviously they're not going to communicate their best or understand their best when the topics aren't at their level. The next thing I want to talk about, point number 2, is that communication is not just over here. It's not just about speech at the lips or with your tongue or with your throat. And it's not even all here above your neck. In fact, to be able to talk, you got to be able to breathe. If you try holding your nose, you can even do this with your child. It's a funny little thing. What would happen if you hold your nose, pinch your nose, close your lips, and try to say your name? Can't do it. So one of the interesting things we find is that without breath, there are no words, there's no speech and language. So there's a lot involved in our speech and language. That really shows us that it's not just at the lips. There's a lot going on with your tongue, with your vocal folds, with other things that are changing the shape of the space between your vocal folds and your lips and in your nose. That's the difference between a kid who sounds like he has a stuffed nose. I'm gonna go to the pub. That has to do with how the air is flowing through his nose and mouth. Sometimes kids have a stuffed nose. Sometimes there's something else going on. But those things can affect how well they're understood. So it goes all the way down from up here in the nose, the lips, the tongue, into the throat, the vocal folds, and all the way into the lungs. But even more than all those physical parts, there's also the heart. So communication is really the intersection between the heart and the body. And what I mean by that is not heart in the sense of blood flow, but children talk about things that they're interested in. So if you think about what was your child's first word, and if you don't know what your child's first word was, or you don't remember, ask some family members what they remember as their child's first word. Everyone will tell you it might have been mommy. Daddy will tell you it was daddy. Others will say their child's first word was cat, tree, birdie, chocolate, I don't know. But all those words have something in common. They mean something to the child. There's a connection. There's an emotional connection with that word. No child's first word is fuchsia, aqua, red, triangle, 3, J. We work with a lot of preschool kids, and we see a lot of parents, and we see a lot of educators too, and everybody's trying to do the best they can to give their child a leg up. But it's somewhat comical how we work with young children, and sometimes we're trying to teach them words that don't mean anything to them and don't have any significance to them. They don't have any relation to it. So if we just take this idea that children's first words and the words that follow in that first stage of language acquisition are all things that they care about. So if we're working with helping our child expand their speech and language, we need to keep that in mind and make sure that we're talking about things that the child is interested in. The next point, point number 3. So we've talked about looking at how kids listen, that before we want to get words coming out, we need to see how they take words in. We need to look at their comprehension before we look at their expression. And anything that we want them to be able to say, we first have to make sure they can understand. We talked about that. That was the first point. The second point is that communication is really this intersection between the head and the heart, the head and the heart, the body and the soul. Communication is not just about words. It's not just a Webster's dictionary that we're trying to stuff into our child's head. It's about their world and the way they relate to it. And that children's first words are always things they care about. So that was our second point. Our third point is to really share with you as a professional and from the research, how do we look at language? And how can we break it down so we can start to describe with more specificity the kinds of problems our kids may be having and different ways we can help them. So let's look at it like this. There are 3 components if you want to look at expressive language, and this comes from a model from Bloom and Leahy, taught to me and my colleagues by our mentor, Sima Gerber. If you have a pen and paper and you want to just take out a pen and paper, or if you want to just visualize it, you can also send us an email. We'll be happy to send you a handout that summarizes the points from this talk. You can email help@schneiderspeech.com. The 3 components are like a Venn diagram, almost like the Olympic rings, but they all touch each other. So in the middle we have language, and then we've got these 3 circles that all touch each other and interact with each other. So we've got form, we've got content, and then we've got use. So form, content, and use. Let's talk about what each of those things are, and then we'll see some examples how they all come together. So for starters, form would be, let's take the word cat. So to be able to say the word cat, cat has a specific form. It's got a consonant, it's got a vowel, and it's got a consonant. That's form. It starts off with a sound k, continues with a, and finishes off with t. That's the form of cat. If you wanted to think about it written, it would need the letter C, the letter A, and the letter T. If a child spelled it K-A-T, you would still know what it was. So even though it wasn't perfect, the form was good enough to kind of give you the symbols to know what they mean. But in its truest form, the form of the word cat is C-A-T or k-at. If you don't have those three sounds in sequence, you don't have a cat. That's form. We can all think of kids who may say, "Oh, putty tat, it's a tat." So they may take the sound at the end of the word, like the T at the end, and actually put it in the beginning. So they say tat. Or they may do other things. Let's say an R doesn't sound like an R. It starts to sound like an L or a W. White. We went to a store, white. So the R's start to sound like W's. Those are all problems with form, the articulation or the spelling. But there's no question we know what the child's saying. And there's no question we know that the child knows what they're talking about, and they're talking about it appropriately. So that's form, when there's a misarticulation, a misspelled word, or a problem that they can't line them up properly. The next thing that we're going to talk about, so over here we had form, over here we got content. Content means, do I know what this thing is? Do I have a representation in my head of what a cat is? It's not as simple as it seems. If you ask yourself to say, well, what is a cat? Oh, that's simple. It's a small, furry animal with 4 legs, a tail, 2 eyes, and 2 ears. I might think of a dog. So content is that part of language where we organize and distinguish familiar knowledge and unfamiliar knowledge, and we kind of sort things out. So as we're learning what a cat is, it's not uncommon that a child will look at other 4-legged animals with a tail, 2 eyes, and 2 ears and say, hey, it's a cat. And really it's a dog, or really it's a cow. But they say cat. That's a perfectly normal developmental stage and presentation that we see in children as they're learning language. As time goes on, we expect them to sharpen and hone in on those things. But in the beginning, they overextend a rule, and then over time they start to contract and get the nuance of where cat becomes dog or where cat becomes a cow. But in the beginning, one shouldn't be concerned if everything they see, a squirrel, a dog, a cow, is all cat. What we can do is we can start to help them see these are cats. You know, there's Siamese cats, and I'm not a cat lover, so I don't know a lot of cats, but there are a lot of kind of cats, and they actually look pretty different. Some of them are hairy, some of them are fluffy, some of them have no hair, some of them have pointier ears, some of them have less pointy ears, but there's something that makes a cat a cat. Another example would be a cookie. So if you had to think about what is a cookie? Well, usually it's round and sweet and crunchy. So then I wonder, what's a graham cracker? Is a graham cracker a cracker or a cookie? It's kind of hard to talk about it, but we all kind of know what makes it what it is. Well, when does cake become cake versus bread versus a cookie? It gets pretty complicated. So just to realize that the world of content is all about knowing, what does this thing mean? What are the definition and boundaries of where this thing becomes something else? So some children, as I said, might call every 4-legged animal with 2 ears and a tail cat. So for them, developmentally, they haven't sharpened in the definition of cat. The content is not fully matured, but the form could be fine. They say the word cat, no problem. Or the child who says, we went to the store, white. There's no problem with his content. He understands what a store is. He just has trouble saying the letter R. Okay? We had form, we had content, and the last one is use. Maybe my favorite because I'm a dad. You know, use means, do you know how to use language? Well, my kids know what cookies are. they know what graham crackers are. They also know what whole wheat crackers are. And if they want to have something sweet as a snack, or they want to have something that's kind of a dessert food, and they haven't eaten their dinner yet, or they've had a couple snacks already, they know that if mommy says no, I'll probably say no also, but they know to come to daddy and ask daddy, or they know to go to my wife to ask other things, or they know not even to ask until they've eaten their dinner, and then they're going to get dessert. And learning the right time and place and person to use different language and to talk about different things, to know that we can talk about certain things and behave certain ways when it's bedtime in our own home, but that's not okay when it's the same time of day, but we're still at the museum or the baseball field. That's all about use, knowing the time, the place, the person, the manner, the way in which we talk. There are ways we can have a temper tantrum to try to get grandma or mom or dad to do something, and that same behavior does not work and is not appropriate in other situations. For example, at the baseball field, at the museum, or at some other holiday party at your boss's house. So learning the right time, place, person, manner, that's use and how we use language. Now this information is going to be really helpful because if you take this information, you can start thinking like a professional speech therapist. So let's take form, content, and use. They all come together in the middle to make good language skills. So if your child is having some misarticulations, mispronunciations, misspelling if they're up to writing, so those are problems in the domain of form. And those could be documented. You could take some video like I suggested before. If video is too hard, you could also take some audio recordings. It's really easy. Turn on your smartphone on a voice note or on a voice recorder and just put it down, face down, and nobody knows it's recording, but you could sit and have cookies and milk with your child, or you could sit and read a book with your child, or you could have bath time play with your child, and you could be recording the audio of that, and then you could listen to it afterwards and kind of write down, well, which words seem to have some mispronunciations, and which words seem to be really clear. One of the tricks that we like to use is we'll tell parents, why don't you make a list? And on one side, why don't you write down what the child meant? So I'll use my example from before. You know, he wants a tutti. A tutti would be another word. Some kids, instead of saying cookie, would say tutti. My nephew has a funny thing that he once said, and no one seems to let him forget it. I hope he's not watching. He once said, "There's dumping dairy in the den." There's dumping dairy in the den. Does anybody know what that means? What he meant to say was, there's something scary in the den, but he turned everything into D's. So everything sounded like there's dumping dairy in the den. And that's another common developmental stage where kids will stop a lot of sounds. So D's and T's and B's and P's, instead of sounds that should sound like, those are sounds that kind of stretch out. Anyway, common developmental mistake. It doesn't mean he needed speech therapy, but it's a common mistake. It would be a classic kind of thing in form. So I would have parents make a list. On one side, write down there or something scary. That's what the child meant. And then I would say on the other side, next to the word of what they meant, write down what they actually said. So you might write down the word dairy. And dairy is what he said, but it meant scary. So we get a nice list of all the things the child intended, what was his meaning, and then we get a nice list of what they actually said. And when you look at that, and certainly if you share it with a professional, someone can kind of look at that and see what patterns emerge, what types of errors the child is making. Sometimes kids make mistakes that are just one letter, like an R or an L. Other times it's a certain quality of letter. Like I said, so scary, putting two consonants together, S-C, those two sounds together are very hard for young kids. So what they'll do is they'll just simplify it and make it one letter and make it a D. Why not? So when we've got these double consonants turning into just one sound, a speech language pathologist can kind of share with you whether that's developmentally appropriate for that child. But if you bring in that list and you bring in that video, whatever professional you turn to can give you a lot more information than if you bring the child in and that day he doesn't want to play nice and he decides to have a tantrum, or he just doesn't show his true colors, or he doesn't choose to really let himself loose with that new professional. Who could blame him? So if you try these recordings and making these lists, you'll really do yourself a service. Let me just turn off one of the other participants. There we go. Okay. Where were we? So the next thing would be one kid, and that would be a tip if he has a problem with form. The next thing I would talk about would be content. So if you have a child where they're talking about everything and everything's the same. So this could also show up with kids who all they talk about are trains. That's the only thing they want to talk about. It's great for kids to have interests, and we want to know what kids' interests are, but we want to start to expand their interests. So think of it in like musical terms, variations on a theme. So if a child is really focused on a certain theme, and every time they play with the blocks, or every time they go to the toy closet, they always choose the same thing. It's the dollhouse, it's the train setup. That's fantastic. What we want to do is we want to take what they're interested in and slowly expand what they play with. So both in terms of the schema or the setup of their play, and also in what they say. So if they always say the same thing, you might want to just see how they begin to embellish or expand or add to that thing that they're talking about. We talked about cats, we talked about dogs, learning the difference between those, and that just continues to move along. We want to see that children's vocabulary and their ability to talk about and understand the world starts to get bigger, broader, more sophisticated. And the way kids learn, and all of us learn, is we take something new. So maybe something I'm saying here is new. You're running it through something that's familiar to you, that you already know. And based on what's familiar to you, you're figuring out how to understand this new information and where to store it. So that's something that's really, really helpful. So when you're teaching a kid something new, you want to think about, well, what's something he already knows related to this? And let me explain it or talk about it or play around with it in relation to something that's already new. One of our other mentors, Renee Tueg, she taught us this idea, coined as new functions with old forms, new forms with old functions. And this means essentially you don't want to be pushing entirely new things in every domain. So if you're teaching a new concept or a new word, make sure that the way you're doing it or the game you're playing or the activity you're using to introduce a new word is a familiar game or activity. And if you're going to introduce a new game, a new activity, a new way of using this language, use words that are familiar. Don't be ramping it up on both sides. In grade school, this would look like if you want to get a really good journal entry out of a kid where he's really going to express himself and use all his words, don't grade him on the spelling. And when you're grading spelling, don't also be looking for creativity, because a lot of kids like me who were not confident in their spelling will have great vocabulary when they're talking, but when they're writing, they can't really remember how to spell magnificent. So everything is described as the castle was so good. The castle was so humongous. I don't know how to spell. It's so big. So when you're looking to do one thing, to increase a child's use of language, increase a child's concepts and content and knowledge, this is very connected to cognitive intelligence, don't be a stickler on the articulation, and don't do it in things that are entirely new and foreign to the child. Try to do it in a context that is familiar to the child. The last thing is use. So we talked a little bit about form, talked a little bit about content. Now we'll talk about use. So use is also really important. Most of the times it's the most natural thing that we see with kids. Obviously, when they're first born, they don't know if it's rude to ask for food, they just cry. They don't know if it's rude to say that your tummy hurts and you need to go to the bathroom, they just cry. They also don't know that you should probably hold it in and go to the bathroom, they just do it. So that's what happens with babies. But very early on, there's a lot of research to suggest, even in utero, they're starting to create a bond with a parent, with a mother. and then ultimately perhaps with their other parent, and then ultimately perhaps with other members of their family. So kids learn relationships, emotional intelligence, and use pretty instinctively. Kids that are struggling with this, it's pretty striking at times. So they might be unrelated. They might not give you feedback. They might not have a lot of affect, a lot of reactivity. You don't see a lot of facial expression. You might see a more kind of a flat, undecided kind of presentation, or a low affect. Kids like this don't seem to get it about the time and the place. And again, this is something developmental. So knowing whether this is appropriate really is a question of where's the child at in that developmental longitudinal journey of growing up. So what might be a disorder at the age of 10, at the age of 6 might just be developmental. Give it time, it'll come along. Or it might be the kind of thing we want to watch and see. Let's touch base in 6 weeks. Let's touch base in 12 weeks. Let's touch base in 6 months and see if this thing has come along. But the younger children are, I don't like to miss things, but I also don't like to be an alarmist. I think the younger kids are, the more it behooves us to ride the wave of time. Time is on our side. All kids grow up. And many of the kids that come to us, their parents come to us with concerns when they're 3, 4, 5 years old. When they come to their bar mitzvah or their bat mitzvah or their confirmation, they almost don't remember why they were concerned way back when. Of course, there are other issues that are truly better off detected early and treated early, but that's not true for every single issue across the board. And for that, it's worthwhile to turn to your pediatrician or talk to a good speech language pathologist, which almost brings us to one of our next points. So that was our third point, which was just looking at the parts of language. So we've got form, we've got content, and we've got use. So again, use, one tip on use would be if you can help your child with the give and take, the back and forth, what I talked about before, sharing the talking time. When you're playing or you're having 10 minutes of quality time, we often recommend for all families and all kids, and it's amazing how hard it is in our tethered world, but just have 5-10 minutes a day with every child, unplugged, quality time. Just unleash yourself and just be a kid again and connect with your child and play games they want to play. Be silly, get down on the ground, be at their eye level, be at their shoulder level, be at a language level and a topic that is at their level. Be at their level, be in their place and share that place with them. And ironically, instead of being up here and talking to them and giving them all kinds of high level exposure, sometimes we can do more to help them grow up by getting them comfortable and getting down to their level. Will actually help them get up, as opposed to trying to pull them and stimulate them all the time, pulling them up into our adult world and our adult interests and our adult language. So in terms of use, a little tip would be take these 5 to 10 minutes of quality time, be there with your child, untethered, unplugged, and focus on the back and forth. Focus on the eye contact. Focus on games like Taboo, games like Pictionary, games like you act out a word and the other person has to guess what it is. And I'm blanking on that word. Great example of form. I can't pull that word out. Pantomime, whatever that game is, where guess what kind of animal I am. Dun-dum, dun-dum. That might be a shark. Another pantomime might be, yeah, that might be my best horse. My kids keep me busy on a lot of these and they're much better than I am. I could have invited them to do it. But those are things that are going to work at this use. Learning how to use language, learning how to use nonverbal language is really important. And picking up on, have I said enough? Have I talked too much? Am I dominating the conversation? Am I taking a turn when I should? Am I not giving a turn? I'm not giving my sister a turn who's waiting to talk. Or more often than not, if it's a boy, an older sister who is quite verbal, and this boy who's younger can't keep up or can't get a word in edgewise. This is where parents, whether it's in this special time or whether it's at the table, My dad likes to say parents have to play air traffic control and kind of decide, who's talking, who's listening. The other nice line my dad always says, what's the opposite of talking? Most people say the opposite of talking is being quiet. That's not really true. The opposite of talking is listening. So if one person's talking and the other person's just not talking, they're just waiting for their turn, but they're being good, there's no communication. If we can learn to give our kids good listening, they're going to want to talk more. And if we can create a culture at our meal table, whether it's every day, every night, or just on the weekend meals, where we actually listen to each other. Everyone gets a turn to talk, everyone gets a turn to listen. Those are things that are going to help the family culture, the relationships, and also help the use, which is an important ingredient in language. One nice tip that we like with that is going around the table and sharing highs and lows. So at our table, we go around and everybody says, hey, what was a highlight from your day? And what was a low light? What was kind of like a great, exciting thing, highlight? And what was a low light? What was one stinky, crummy, not so pleasant thing? And all of us, the kids, each at their own level, and the adults, the parents, kind of model for the kids, talking about the things that were exciting, which gives a chance to kind of retell the story, create the narrative, bring back that memory. It's great for language. It's great for emotional stuff. It's just really great. And then the other side of it is talking about the lowlights. Sometimes we don't give kids enough space to safely talk about the things that are unpleasant, things that are bothering them. Certainly there could be serious things we want to hear about. There could be other kids that are bothering them or bullying them. There might be something inappropriate going on in this day and age. We certainly want to keep an open line of communication with our kids. But it might be something innocuous, like I went to the bathroom and guess what? There was no toilet paper left. Can you believe that? It was so embarrassing. So I had to kind of like figure out what to do, and the kid might talk about that, or the adult might talk about that. Who knows? There's nothing loaded about that, but it's certainly a good thing to be able to kind of unload that low light, that unpleasant experience. So those are the three parts of language. So we've covered three things so far. If you want to review, we talked about looking at how kids listen, not just looking at their expression, but looking at their comprehension. That's what we do as professionals before we look at their expression. Second thing we talked about was talking and speech and language and communication is not just here, and it's not just here, and it's not just here. It's really the intersection of the body and the soul, or the head and the heart. Kids talk about things they care about. We talked about that. So think about making sure the things you're talking about, things you're looking for, things you're expecting from your child, and things you're trying to put into your child revolve around things they care about. The third point we talked about was just the different parts of language. We got form, content, and use, and they all need to come together to give us language that's kind of cohesive and developing nicely. Some kids have a problem in one of those areas, and it's really helpful if you could talk about that with your professional or with your pediatrician, and then be able to talk about which areas are kind of relatively strong. My child is really smart, has a lot of good concepts and ideas. He uses words in the right places and right manner and with the right people. He just has these misarticulations. What do you think we should do about it? That kid might just have some articulation problems. Another kid, he's really great. He's socially appropriate. He's fantastic. He's fun. He's exciting. He has great vocabulary. He talks about things. He's like the wizard when it comes to certain topics. But in regular topics, he has trouble pulling out the words. He has trouble expressing his ideas. Even though he knows about them, he has trouble putting them together and getting them out. Sometimes that's a problem with the way they're storing the language and the ideas. Sometimes it's a problem finding the right words, but you could talk about that. It's not a problem with use. Whereas you have another child who, no, they talk about things just fine. They've got great ways to talk about things. In fact, they could talk and talk and talk, kind of like I'm doing here today. But what they have trouble with is they articulate well, they talk well, but they just don't have a sense of other people in their space. They kind of dominate conversations, or they can't negotiate things with, whether it's sharing with another kid or whether it's a change of plans. There's a certain rigidity and a certain, almost could be seen as narcissistic, but it's not at all narcissistic. They just can't see beyond themselves. They don't see the world of people around them and how their behavior affects others. That would be something that focuses on use. Hope those examples were helpful. We can certainly talk about that more in future webinars, and you can certainly email us, help@schneiderspeech.com. Look forward to being in touch on that. The fourth point is diagnoses and treatment. And here I'm going to quote a third mentor, very influential person in my career, and his name is Dr. Joel Stark. And he always said, you know, diagnoses are important, and he taught us to be really, really good at figuring out, you know, differential diagnosis. What's one thing, what's another thing, because good treatment and good therapy has to be grounded on a good diagnostic understanding. At the same time, too often, people use diagnoses like labels. I'll give you an example. I got a phone call today from a fellow who asked me, do you work with 20-something-year-olds who have Asperger's? I said, yes. So do you think you can help him, or can you fix it? And I said, well, can you tell me a little bit about this person? And it turns out it was sort of a friend calling for his friend's son. So he didn't even know the boy, but he's using the word Asperger's as if when he uses the word Asperger's, I'm going to know exactly what this boy is like, this 20-something-year-old young man. And I said, well, you're using the word Asperger's, so I sort of have an idea that he's probably bright, probably his form and his content is relatively good. Somewhere in the social nuance and the use of language, that's probably where it's hard for him. But the only way that I could help this person is if I meet them. I want to welcome a new person, but just tone you down. Great. So the only way I could help that young person is if I get to know who they are. So this goes to diagnoses and treatment, and our professor, Dr. Joel Stark, used to say, labels are for cans. You don't want to work with someone who talks about your child like they're an acronym. Oh yeah, he's OCD. Oh yeah, he's ADD. Now on the one hand, the diagnosis is helpful and it has a place, certainly on an IEP or for insurance purposes. On the other hand, too often we look at kids, and instead of looking at them for who they are or using their name, we start to talk about them as if they are the label. So that's just a little bit of a pet peeve of ours with labels, and labels are for cans, not for people. But nonetheless, it's important to know what these different diagnoses are. So I'll just talk about them just really, really briefly and broadly and relate them back to what we talked about before. So we've got Asperger's, autistic spectrum disorder, which could be abbreviated as ASD. We've got high functioning autism, HFA. Those are kind of related. They represent a spectrum of diagnoses and different levels of functioning. What it mostly points out is a very prominent feature that the use of language or the relational, emotional connection, social connection with other people is hard for that child. Then we've got labels like ADD, ADHD. Those have to do with attention regulation, how well a person can attend and focus, especially on things that might be more boring. So they might be very bright, they might be very social, they might have great form and articulation and words. They might just take a long turn talking, not because they're socially oblivious, but just because they're so darn excited and they're fully invested in whatever they're doing. You might notice that I'm pretty passionate about that because I can relate to it. I also have a child or two that have a flavor of that. So ADD and ADHD. The problem with ADD and ADHD is there are times that we can't be our full effervescent selves, especially as we get into first grade and beyond, where we've got to sit behind a desk, where we've got to learn there's a time to sit and to listen to frontal instruction, and then there's a time to get out in the yard and play, and then there's time at home. But some of the impulsivity and inhibition of that impulsivity, kind of like important as you go through grade school. So that has to do with attention and attention regulation and things like that. Then we've got other acronyms like LD, LLD, learning disability, or a language learning disability. Those relate specifically to kids that have a language difficulty or a learning disability, which is more broad and vague and less descriptive. So again, as you hear these things, it's important to know what does it mean, and it's also important to know what it doesn't mean. And it's also important to know, what does it mean other people are going to think when they hear that acronym, and how can you advocate for your child using that acronym if it's helpful, but at other times kind of helping people know, you know what, he carries that label or diagnosis, but don't think of him like that only, because there's also this other side of him that you might not realize or might not think when you hear that label. So diagnoses are important, and especially helping us create good treatment has to be based on a good diagnostic understanding. But at the same time, labels are for cans. They're good for IEPs, they're good for insurance, they're good for a lot of things, but they're definitely not good for capturing the essence of a person, of a child, and who they really are. For that, you really have to sit with someone and get to know them. For that, you really need a free text field to write a lot about, what is this kid like? What does he dislike? What does he do really well? What are some of the most amazing accomplishments or great projects he's achieved? What are the type of social relationships he has? What are some of the things he does in the family that everyone turns to him that he does really well? What are some of the things he struggles with? Where does he tantrum? Those are the kind of descriptive things that we're looking for to get deeper than just the acronym of the diagnosis, but diagnoses are important. There are some other important diagnoses to begin to be aware of. One of them is called auditory processing disorder, APD, or central auditory processing disorder, CAPD. That's an interesting one because those kids have good hearing. So on a pure tone test, beep, 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 they do fine. But what they have trouble with is when it's in the presence of a classroom. Not in a quiet room like this, but in a classroom, the background noise makes them batty. Or they can't filter out the background noise and the foreground noise. So instead of hearing the teacher talking in the front of the class, all they hear is that kid rustling his pencil against his paper. And for him, that noise is in the foreground. Whereas for you and I, hopefully, we're able to put it in the background. So it has to do with how you process auditory input, how you process sound to pull out the language meaning and filter out all the stuff you're meant to filter out. So hopefully you all see me in the foreground, not the bridge. But someone with auditory processing difficulty or disorder, they might not be able, in an auditory kind of way, to be able to filter that out. I think those are most of the important ones. Another one is nonverbal learning disability. So that's another interesting one where the verbal language component is actually intact. So it's not a language disorder like a typical language disorder. Rather, it's the nonverbal elements. So it might show up in other areas between the words, between the lines, or in math, or in other things. So that's nonverbal learning disability. So that gives you a couple diagnoses, a couple ideas about treatment. I think the most important tip on this point would be, little people, what do they need to be successful learners and communicators and great friends? They need to have fun, they need to have friends, and they need to have success. They don't need Kuman overprogrammed in their life. They don't need tutors in every single subject every night of the week from the time they get home till the time they go to sleep. Some of those things might be important, but don't forget, the way normal kids learn is by being normal kids. And especially in the big cities, sometimes we forget that. So I think that it's very important to be tuned in and aware of what's happening with our kids' speech and language, but it's equally important to let them be kids, because they actually learn when they're playing in the backyard. They learn when they go to the community pool. They learn when they have play dates. They learn through playing dollhouse. They learn through the train set and Legos and all kinds of things. So let kids be kids. Let them have fun. Help them cultivate successful play dates. Maybe parents be present for the play date to make it more successful, to help them navigate and negotiate being a host, how to be a guest, how to invite someone over. Set a time that's reasonable. As kids grow up, they can handle longer play dates. As they're younger, they need to be much, much shorter. Think about how to give your children fun, friends, and success. The most important thing for self-esteem, one of my beliefs is, people come to us and they say, my child needs help with his self-esteem. He doesn't have a lot of self-worth. He's lacking confidence. And I think to myself, I have 4 children. They were all born with great self-esteem, with great confidence. Somewhere along the way, things happen that can jeopardize that or hurt that. We don't need to give kids good confidence and self-esteem. We just have to protect the self-esteem that they were born with. And when you think about school, school is an amazing institution. And at the same time, it's a tricky one, because if a child starts to learn that they can't be successful socially, academically, behaviorally, they start to learn that they're not being successful. And that message starts to compound itself as they start to go down months and years of schooling. So it's important to make sure that our kids are having a successful experience in school. And if they're not having a successful experience in school, let's think what we can do about that. But if they're not having a successful experience at school, the last thing we want to do is make them feel unsuccessful at home. So if we can't do anything about what's happening at school, at least let us give them a successful experience of themselves at home. And we can do that by giving them and cultivating the things they're interested in, the talents they show a proclivity for, experiences that they're craving, ways to earn reinforcement, like if they do their chores, or if they do certain things, or if they don't do certain things, giving them a token, whether it's a gift, whether it's special time, whether it's a lollipop, whatever it may be. Those things build self-esteem, especially important for any child, but even more so for the child that's struggling at school to feel successful. Those are the points that we said we're going to hit on. There were 4 points. You'll be able to watch this video later. If you want to email us at help@schneiderspeech.com, I'll just quickly review. We talked about looking at how kids listen, not just how they talk. More important than their expression, language expression, is their language comprehension. And that spills into what we do to help them with their speech and language. We don't just want to pull words out of them. We want to expose them to a lot and give them rich, multi-sensory opportunities to explore, to hear, to taste, to see our lips and our mouth moving to make certain words, and also to touch and feel the things that they're talking about. The second thing we talked about was that speech and language is not just at the lips or in the throat. It's where the head and the heart intersect. Kids don't talk about things that are in the Webster Dictionary. They talk about things they care about. So if we want to help a child develop their speech and language, we need to be focused on what are the things they care about and get down at their level about what they care about at their level. That's going to be the best thing to do to help your child's speech and language develop. Third thing we talked about was we broke apart language, this very abstract, overwhelming, confusing topic. We said it's really made of 3 areas that intersect like a Venn diagram from the Bloom-Leahy model, and that is there's form, there's content, and there's use. The last thing we talked about was treatment and diagnosis. The very last thing I want to say at the end of this webinar is there are 3 tips I want to give you to think about how to find the right professional. If you know that you need help, or if you're deciding what to do next, I think the first step is you might want to talk to your pediatrician. On the other hand, not every pediatrician is tuned into the subtlety of speech and language development and might quickly or too quickly tell you, give it some time, don't worry about it, my kid had the same thing, I see it all the time. And again, to defend the pediatricians who might say that, they do see a lot of kids, so they do have a lot of perspective. What they might not have is they might have a lot of time to listen to you, the parent, expressing your concern. With limited time, they get a quick description snapshot, and they give you their best judgment. Now again, most pediatricians are fantastic, and you should have a good pediatrician. And if you don't, you should find one that you like and that you feel gives you the time of day and is really up to date on the latest best practices. But if you don't feel like your pediatrician heard you out, don't rely on what your pediatrician said alone. You can't discredit your paternal or maternal instinct. If you feel there's something there, take the next step. So the 3 things to look for when you're looking for a good professional: number 1, they should be licensed and accredited and have proper degree and license, and that's something you can ask any professional when you talk to them. The second thing is make sure, well, this is actually connected to the first one, they should have a license and they should have a degree in whatever it is they're working on. And with that, you want to ask them, how many children 4 years old with articulation problems have you worked with in the past 2 years? Or if my child is 7 and he's stuttering, how many 7-year-olds who stutter have you worked with in the past 2-3 years? Because that really tells you their competence and their experience, not in general as a professional, but with this age and this issue. And that's what you're looking for. You're not just looking for the world's best speech therapist who's great at one thing but not what your kid needs, or helps young kids but not 16-year-olds. So make sure they have that. Number two is make sure your child feels relaxed and comfortable. It's normal for a kid to be upset and not want to go to an appointment. They often think they're going to the doctor and they're going to get shots. Make your child comfortable as possible. If they do cry and they're upset going to an appointment, that's okay too. The professional should find a way to make them feel at ease over the first appointment, maybe the second, maybe the third. But if you have 3 appointments in a row and your child is not at ease and they're kicking and screaming going each time, you probably should think about that and talk about it with the professional, but I probably would discourage continuing anything if 3 times in a row the child is kicking and screaming and really struggling, and you're struggling to get your child to go to that professional. It might be time to find a better fit. It could be distance, it could be personality, it could be the space, or it could be something else that's totally fixable, but don't keep going without problem solving it or finding a better fit. And the last thing, and the most important thing, is that you as a parent should feel that you have a listening ear, that this professional should really hear you out in a way that the time demands of a pediatrician might not allow. This professional should give you a chance to articulate your concerns, your worries, your fears, your intuition, and respond with responses that you feel are dignified, are on point, and are informational as well as practical. So that wraps up our webinar for today. I hope you all enjoyed. We welcome you to email us at help@schneiderspeech.com. You can join us online at schneiderspeech.com. You can look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we look forward to more webinars like this. Thank you for joining. And if you missed it, reach out and we'll send you the link.